Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this really fantastic panel. My name is Erin Aoyama. I am a PhD candidate in American Studies at Brown University. I'm also a curatorial assistant at JANM, and I'm part of the steering committee for TDIMA. And I'm just so absolutely excited to be here with these four esteemed colleagues and friends. Each of us is interested and invested in historical storytelling and the power that memory holds and can have in our lives and how we live in relation to each other, to our ancestors, to the land around us. So we really wanted to sort of have a conversation that got into some of those questions and things that motivate us. So I'm joined this evening by four really wonderful scholars and friends who I'm going to introduce really quickly, and then I will pass it off to them to tell us a little bit about their methods and the questions that drive their work in these related but slightly different fields. So first up, we will hear from Nicole Sintetos, who is a historian and an educator whose dissertation project is an environmental history of Tule Lake, with a particular focus on the Bureau of Land Reclamation and its relationship to racialized labor and native dispossession. Hey, Nicole. Then we will hear from Koji Lau-Ozawa, who is a historical archaeologist whose research examines the intersecting realms of landscapes, diaspora, material culture, and memory within Japanese American incarceration history, with a particular focus on collaborating with the Gila River Indian community, among many other projects that Koji's working on. Then we'll hear from Lisa Doi. Lisa is an organizer with Tsudu for Solidarity. She's also a fellow JANM staff person with me. She's an anthropologist and an ethnographer whose work both in graduate school and with Tsudu is deeply engaged with abolitionist and racial healing work. And then Dr. Mika Kennedy will bring us home. Mika is currently an assistant professor of Asian American Studies at Ithaca College, and Mika's teaching and writing centers race, ethnicity, and indigeneity in American literature and the environmental humanities. So please ask every question that you've ever wanted to ask of a professor or a graduate student to help us kind of dig into our disciplines and how we do the work that we do and why we do the work that we do. I can say with absolute certainty that I learn something from each of these folks every time that I talk with them. So I'm so excited about this conversation, and thank you all for being here in the midst of so much going on in your lives. I wish that we could actually be hanging out at a bar somewhere, but this will have to do for now. Before I hand this over to Nicole to tell us a little bit more about history as a discipline, what it is, what it does, we wanted all of us to sort of take a moment to remember one of our mentors and teachers, Franklin Odo, who passed away recently. I think we all probably have our own memories of and favorite stories about Franklin, which really speaks so much to the person that he was. And I invite each of you to share, your own thoughts or reflections if you'd like when you're speaking about Franklin. But we wanted, as kind of a group from the outset, to acknowledge and remember and thank Franklin for everything that he did for the field of Asian American studies and especially Japanese American history. Most recently, Franklin was a professor. He taught Asian American Studies at Amherst College. But before that, among many other positions, he was the first director of the Ethnic Studies program at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and he was the founding director of the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. So you've probably seen him on programming that we've done actually in the last 2 years. Several of us in this session also knew Franklin as one of the leaders of the Tsudu for Solidarity Scholars Council. So in addition to his research and his writing and his teaching, Franklin sought out ways always for our scholarship to be engaged with and useful to our communities. I'm so grateful as a junior scholar to be following in the footsteps, or at least trying to follow in the footsteps of someone like Franklin. And I actually still have a note on my desk from a few weeks ago with a reminder to reach out to Franklin with a question about something I was working on. And I've just sort of kept it there as a reminder of Franklin and just how grateful I am that I felt comfortable enough to just email him with, some questions that he would probably find very basic and easy to answer. But I'm really going to miss his wisdom, his leadership, his energy, his kindness, and his generosity, especially that generosity towards those of us coming up after him. So thank you, Franklin, for everything. With that, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce, sorry, a rougher transition, but Nicole Sintetos to share a little bit about her work and history as a discipline. Hey, Nicole.
Hi, Erin. Thank you so much for the introduction. As Erin noted, I am the historian of the bunch, and in my 4.5 minutes that I have with you, if there's one message I can get across, it is that you do not need to have a PhD or be in grad school or even have studied history in order to think like a historian. These are skills that we can all carry with us every day. Also, that there are a million different ways to do history. And so, again, in my 4.5 minutes, I'm just going to talk about a sliver of how I begin to approach some projects, especially projects that have to do with Japanese American incarceration. So, first, as a historian, I often think, where is my archive located and what is my archive? And an archive, in its most basic sense, is a repository of historical information. And, when you think of the word archive, maybe you think of like dusty shelves somewhere in a fortress that's hard to reach. And of course, there are some archives like that, but there are also community archives. It's truly anywhere that's a repository of historical information. And if I could go back to like my youthful young self, like before I went to college, etc., I had assumed that those archives are for fancy people, like wearing suits, who like knew how to get past the gatekeeping. And the more I've learned and the more I've worked in this field, the more I've realized that these archives are actually built for the public. They are for everyone. It is worth, just emailing a place if you know that there are materials there that you want to access as a community member. And 9 times out of 10, those archives can and should let you in. And so part of what we work on is what gets into the archive, meaning what is deemed worthy of being remembered in a way that requires time and money to preserve it, and what doesn't get into the archive. And how, as historians, can we also think about centering the texts, materials, and voices that are so often not in the archive, capital A, archive? The other way I approach projects early on is to think about how do I want to access or read a text. And a text can be anything from a historical document long buried for 100 years, that's someone's letter. It can be a song, like an element from pop culture. It could be a photograph. It could be an oral history from someone last week remembering something 75 years ago. And so there's a multitude of different texts to use to write. And when I think about these reading practices, there are 2 major ways that inform how we look at a text. The first is called reading with the grain, meaning you look at an object and you think, what was the author's intent, right? What can we tell about this object or piece based on when it was created? What are sort of the mainstream investments from that time that we can see reflected in the text? And then there's another method called reading against the grain, which I think many people in this Zoom center in their work, which is thinking about how can we do a resistant reading to pull forth or extract some of the beliefs that are hidden in the text, that are not meant to be scrutinized, that the author may not have put forward or had intended to share, but are nevertheless there, and share a little bit about that time period. So I have an image to sort of talk through this process. So a couple of years ago, I went to the local county museum at Tule Lake. And so here for me is what I would consider an object from my archive. And before you do anything else, just observe, right? I notice that there are 9 images. I notice that all of the people in the image appear to be white. I notice in the center bottom, there's a building that says Tule Lake. I notice in the top right, there is a man pointing outward into the distance, holding his wife's hand. I notice that there appears to be a parade. Really stop and linger and observe. I think we get in trouble sometimes when we jump too quickly to making a conclusion before we've actually finished the act of looking. From there, think about your questions, right? How did these images get here? Who did the labor to organize these images? What do these images want me to see? What do these images not want me to see? And then I turn to the archive from various places and do some research to try to get to the bottom of this. And so, next slide. And so I learned, based on sort of timestamps in the back of the images, that in the immediate post-war period at Tule Lake, many of the barracks were sold to veterans of World War II, free save for the price of shipping. And so I can guess that many of these images in the frames were from that group of veterans who settled. And then can you go back one more time? And then you go back and look, and you sit with your object longer, and you observe again. And this is when I realized, or a researcher might realize, look at the actual frame. What is the frame? The frame is actually a window from an incarceration barrack from Tule Lake. And suddenly the object gains a new meaning, right? It becomes intrinsically tied to the history of Japanese American incarceration, even though it perhaps was not the author's intent for the history of incarceration to be at the forefront of what we're looking at. And I'm going to pause there. I'm happy to go back to these images and talk a little bit more, but this is just a little bit of a teaser, and I look forward to chatting with everyone else. Oh, and next up, we have Koji. Thanks, Koji.
Thanks, Nicole. Thank you, Erin, for the introduction, and everybody in this panel and this bar hangout, virtual bar hangout. And I'm glad that Nicole ended with talking about the frame of the photograph, because it feels very archaeological. So I'm an archaeologist, and I think what we're going to see today is that a lot of what all we do sort of blends and overlaps and blurs. And though we're an archaeologist, anthropologist, historian, and literary specialists, that we all sort of do different things, but also sort of do the same thing in different ways. So I do archaeology. I'm a historical archaeologist. What does that mean? It does not mean wearing a fedora and carrying a whip and leather jackets, but looks at the sort of material remains of the past. And so the archaeologists use archives as well as objects in slightly different ways than historians, perhaps, although again, the way Nicole reads the photographs is very similar. So we look at the past through landscapes and objects. So I try to think about places and layers, both literal when excavating. One of the main tools of archaeologists is to excavate, to dig into the ground, and to dig through the earth to understand what was deposited in the past. But other times we don't dig. So a big part of the research and work I've been doing is working with indigenous tribes on how best to approach the past on indigenous land, which in some cases means no excavation, one of the traditional tools of archaeologists, but understanding the landscape through different lenses. And so what's left on the surface, how has the surface transformed over time, both through the past and in the present day, and how are those echoes from the past still present to read on the landscape. Looking at incarceration camps at Gila River, one of the big things that I've been examining there are the gardens that people built, and understanding both the context that people were modifying the landscape, how it was modified before, and the impacts of that modification, and knowing that it's just one moment within this longer time stream, both in the longest of time streams and geological formations, as well as the slightly shorter time streams in the life and histories of the Altum people and the Piposh who lived in the American Southwest and lived there to this day. And then for the period in which Japanese Americans were incarcerated on that landscape and how they interacted with that. And so thinking about the landscape in these layers, in this wider, broader picture, is one of the ways I think archaeology tries to be present in place and think about the material realities of history. And the second way is through those materiality, through objects. Where do they come from? How are they made? How do people interact with them? And one of the great things that always inspired me about archaeology was to be able to think about the everyday things that people don't necessarily think about writing down or recording, what they used to eat, what they wore, what they picked up, what they interacted with on their day-to-day, and how those objects really contoured their lives, what they experienced through those objects and what meanings they invested in them. And so that's another really big part of, I think, how archaeologists think of history and memory is what do objects mean to people at the time? How do those meanings change through history, through context, through exchange? A bowl that you eat out of is sometimes just a bowl. Other times it's something that you brought from home. Other times it's something that broke, but also you repair or you pass down, or that held your keys or held your keepsakes that maybe you didn't eat out of. And so these meanings that objects get invested in through their day-to-day use are some of the lenses that we try to think through. So I'll end my little spiel there and pass it down to somebody in a broader department that archaeology is housed in, Lisa, an anthropologist.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's listening to you talk, Koji, it's sort of interesting that I think there's a lot of methodological overlap between archaeology and cultural anthropology. It's just whether sort of the people are, generally speaking, alive or not alive, or really, really, really not alive, depending on how, where your fieldwork takes place. So, you know, my undergraduate training is in cultural anthropology. And then as I've sort of progressed into a master's program and a doctoral program, I've moved more towards interdisciplinary work. So I'd like to start by talking a little bit about anthropology and its method, which is ethnography. And then also talking a little bit about what Erin and Nicole and I are doing, which is American studies, and trying and probably failing to explain that a little bit. But anthropology, you know, is the study of people. And so people can sort of, there are many subfields of anthropology. We talked about archaeology. There's even sort of human evolution and biological anthropology. There's the study of language. But the field I'm most familiar with is cultural anthropology, which is sort of trying to understand how and why people do things. And I think often about like the David Foster Wallace talk, This is Water, where sort of this is culture is the thing you swim in every day. And sometimes when you're part of it, it's hard to see that because it's so normal. It's so routinized into your life that it's hard to recognize it as something that might be interesting to someone else. And the method of sort of cultural anthropologists is ethnography, which is, you know, sometimes it's jokingly or not jokingly described as hanging out, but sort of long-term engagement with a culture through the practice of sort of observation, participant observation, so participating in cultural practices and then writing about it. And, you know, very traditionally, anthropology is sort of imagined as like these white men from civilized places going to far, far away places to study uncivilized people. And I think in the past 30 years, and especially in the past maybe 10 years, cultural anthropology has really wrestled with that history. I mean, there's still wrestling to do, but in particular, I'll maybe talk briefly about sort of the sites and then who studies anthropology. So, you know, there's been a push to sort of move away from the idea that you have to go somewhere else to do cultural anthropology, but that you can, in fact, and should maybe do cultural anthropology that's closer to home, to recognize that obviously in the contemporary United States, there are rich cultures happening, and it can be a very fruitful place for field work here. And also, I think there's been a growing acceptance of people studying their own cultures that they're part of, whether through a maybe more traditional ethnographic approach, or even at sort of the most extreme, like experimental ethnographic approaches, like autoethnography, where you're sort of writing through yourself and through your own understanding of the world. So just, I think that there are some really exciting directions that ethnography is going in. But I'll move a second to talk more about American studies and this concept of interdisciplinary work. And so, American studies as a field, again, emerged in like the early 20th century, and really emerged at the intersection of history and English. Like, what if you brought those two fields together? And maybe Mika and Nicole could talk about that. But over time, I think it's sort of broadened. But to me, it's the idea of interdisciplinary work is taking one of these discrete disciplines, or two of these discrete disciplines that we've been talking about, and trying to bring to bear some of the best of the methodological, theoretical, or disciplinary work that they offer. And so for me, I think about the concept of memory as being the perfect thing to study at the intersection of history and anthropology, because I think there are aspects of memory that are archived in traditional archives that Nicole has talked about, in paper files and paper documents that are very historical in nature. But I think memory also has this aspect of interpretation and sort of culturally based interpretation. And that's where I think that ethnography is a very useful tool to be able to understand that maybe how people remember the past isn't perfectly reflected in an archive, or maybe how histories get passed down through families is different than what you might find in an academic library or other kind of archive. And that's where I think, to me, interdisciplinary work offers this great potential. And I just wanted to end by talking about one of my sort of favorite concepts, which is ide, which I think has sort of gotten some buzz right now with Duncan Williams' Ide Cho. And, he'll talk about how at Manzanar and Amachi and Rower, you have the Ide To or Ide He memorial tablets. But I think about the scholar Lisa Yoneyama, who writes about Ide as the soul consoling, but to her it is also this practice of remembrance that is an act of caring for the dead. And so I think a lot about my own academic work and work on memory, not just for the living, but as an act of sort of accompaniment or learning alongside the dead. And so sort of excited to get to do that with this group of people. And I will pass to Mika to wrap us up.
That is actually a really great segue, Lisa, because I was thinking about what literary scholarship has to offer, thinking about kind of historical moments, historical narratives. And I think really at the core of it, it's about kind of contending with or thinking through these afterlives. So to continue this sort of staying with the dead theme, but afterlives in the sense of the fact that any piece of literature is going to be kind of a second or third or fifth telling of a story, whether it be written by someone who was incarcerated, but now they're kind of framing their experiences in a particular way after having experienced them, or whether it be writings that are done by their descendants or writings that are done by members of the Japanese American community, regardless of whether those people have relatives who are incarcerated or not, and sort of contending with what it means to have this kind of communal memory, and how one can then kind of creatively interrogate or interpret or kind of live with that through writing and various other cultural productions. And so Ithaca College, where I am at, is primarily a teaching college. So I wanted to start with something that my student brought up. And she was quoting a passage from a poem by Brandon Shimoda titled 49 Stones for the Poetry of Japanese American Incarceration. And at the end of that poem, he asks, what is the difference between history and memory? And when we were talking about this as a class, it sort of began as you might expect, where people are like, okay, history and memory. History feels like the large scale version of things. It feels like what really happened. And memory feels like the personal version of things. It might be mutable or changeable, or it might have that experiential element. But then, as we've been talking about history and memory and what exactly all those things are, the conversation also tends to begin to recognize that history itself is highly narrative. And depending on whether you're reading with or against the grain, like Nicole mentioned, there can be a lot more to these historical narratives than just what really happened, quote unquote. And for memory, a lot of it can be very personal, or it can be familial, it can be intergenerational, and there can be forms of memory that don't just reside in one person. And the literary begins to be a place where we can kind of contend with some of those entanglements, right? And so I really wanted to talk about 3 different things that you might encounter in literature that get at some of the entanglement, some of the strangeness, some of the creativity that comes out of these narratives. And so the first one is a word that, if you're a medieval scholar, you may be very familiar with. If you are not a medieval scholar, may have not heard before, but it's called a palimpsest, where there are layers of different things and that you can rub through those things and see multiple layers all at once. And an example of something that kind of has this quality to it is the experimental documentary History and Memory, aptly titled, by Rhea Tajiri. And one of the things that kind of opens this documentary is a way of categorizing history and memory. The quote's a little bit long, but you know what? I'm going to go ahead and just read the full thing. And the kind of subtitle of this documentary says, "There are things which have happened in the world while there were cameras watching, things we have images for. There are things which have happened while there were no cameras watching, which we restage in front of cameras to have images of. There are things which have happened for which the only images that exist are in the minds of the observers present at the time, while there are things that have happened for which there have been no observers except for the spirits of the dead." And what these lines are really getting at is, again, kind of different versions of history and memory one might encounter, or their absence. But because this is a documentary and it's not just text, one of the interesting things about it, the palimpsestic things about it, is that when talking about things we have images for, things that were there while cameras were watching, the thing that might be closest to like what really happened, one of the clips is from a movie, a Hollywood film called From Here to Eternity, which is a romantic, dramatic Hollywood type film. And yet it includes archival footage of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And so you end up with this palimpsestic question around what does it mean to have this kind of Hollywood romance that also has this archival piece of history embedded into its narrative? What kind of verisimilitude does it offer to this? What kind of contrast is there between a romantic narrative that oftentimes Japanese Americans do not feel particularly kind of resembles their experiences of World War II, and this archival kind of military footage of the bombing of Pearl Harbor? And what then do we do with that? And so that's the first thing you might encounter as one of these kind of entanglements in literature. The second might be absence, right? The things that have happened for which there are have been no observers except for the spirits of the dead. And a text that kind of gets at this, dear students, we have read this one if you're online, is called Displacement by Kiku Hughes. It's a recent graphic novel. And what is kind of stand out about this one is that time travel is involved. And so it's a historical narrative, but Kiku, the main character, time travels from where she's living in 2016 on the cusp of Trump's election to 1941, 42, and through the war, where she has kind of slipped through time and ended up in an incarceration camp, living the experience of incarcerees. And ultimately, what she discovers is that she has had this experience, has slipped through time in this way, because she's passing through her grandmother's memories. The thing that's interesting, though, about this novel is that she actually doesn't have those stories. Her grandmother didn't tell these stories to her mother, to her. And so it's something that exists outside of kind of conscious knowledge. And even though she slipped through time and is living side by side with her grandmother, they never actually speak with each other. They don't interact because there isn't that direct line. And so thinking about how narrations can contend with absence, can contend with the stories that weren't told and will never be told, becomes really interesting in that text. And so number 2 is contending with absence within literature. Number 3, finally, is the notion of remix. I wanted to take us back to the poem 49 Stones for the poetry of Japanese American incarceration, because one of the things that Shimoda is talking about in that poem is also thinking about ways to creatively engage with the extant literary archive. And he talks about a poet named David Mura, who has written poems called Internment Epistles. And what this is poetry that is remixing or kind of writing with these letters that were written by the Matsushita family, who were Issei, who were incarcerated during World War II, and trying to think about what it means to both have these narratives and hold them up in their originary form, and also to kind of break them down and think about ways of working with these texts as someone who is Sansei or third generation, and still finding new ways to encounter these narratives, finding new ways to bring them into new conversations forever so that they aren't left behind, so that that conversation is always there, or in recognition of a conversation that could never be left behind. And I think to close out, that those types of explorations are really at the core of kind of literary scholarship and thinking through these creative afterlives of a historical moment, and thinking through the ways that it is always kind of part and parcel of this present that has come out of it, and thinking through what futures might be imagined. What sorts of new angles can there be to this story to help us recognize things that might not have been evident from initial narratives or what is now the mainstream narrative. And this goes back to what Koji was saying about really thinking through kind of archaeology that is attentive to place and indigenous place, and thinking through what it looks like to know that Japanese American incarceration is an experience that also kind of dovetails with indigenous dispossessions, that also dovetails with immigration policies with regard to kiku and displacement in 2016 kind of politics, and thinking about those connections and taking that as kind of the central core of literary study in Japanese American incarceration. So thank you so much to the panelists for teeing me up and having all of those interesting through lines already. And thank you so much to Erin for introducing us. And I'll go ahead and turn it back to her.
Thank you so much. I was like beaming and writing notes furiously while all of you were speaking. And I just feel so lucky to be able to learn with and from you. And yeah, just hearing all of these threads that we didn't really plan, but obviously I think, Koji, you said this first, there's so much crossover between the work that we're doing, both because of the subject matter, but I think because of the ways that we're approaching it. So just thank you. And you're all just such great teachers. It's really a joy to sit here and learn. I have a lot of questions. I'm sure there's also things that, you would like to talk about together as a group, but we do have an audience question that I think kind of gets at something that I also wanted us to talk about. So maybe if it's okay, we'll just kind of start there and then zoom out a little bit to some other questions. But Sam Mihara, who's watching, hi Sam, thanks for watching, asks, as a child in Heart Mountain, we enjoyed gathering arrowheads. We created collections. We took them home to California. Was that wrong? Should they be returned to today's Crow? And I think I would add a little bit of framing to this question and say that one of the things I wanted to sort of ask each of you about, that most of you also talked about, is this question of ethics in research. We talk a lot about absence. We talk about reading against the grain or contending with these kind of entanglements, or this question of memory versus history. And I think this is so interesting. And I'm wondering, please respond to Sam's question. I'm sure each of you has thoughts about this kind of question or experience sort of working with questions like this. But also, I think in your own research, as you sort of approach the questions that drive your work, how do you contend with ethics? And sometimes you find stories or you hear stories that you are asked not to tell, or that are not meant to be told, or any sort of number of things that fall under that umbrella. And I will say that we don't often talk about ethics in the academy, but I know in this group we talk about it a lot, because it's important to us as people and as community members doing this work. So a very broad question alongside Sam's question that just sort of, I'm inviting you to reflect on how you think about ethics in your own work. And I will just let whoever wants to jump in first jump in here too.
I'll jump in as an archaeologist. Taking arrowheads, was that wrong, and should they be returned? I think there's was it wrong is always morality and ethics are always difficult questions to wrestle with. I will say that the collection of materials related to Native American and indigenous groups is a practice that I think has been common in the US and in many lands in which indigenous land and materials have been dispossessed, and has been hobbified, or was hobbified, became a hobby for a lot of people. But it's sort of predicated on two interwoven viewpoints. That one, things on the landscape are there to be taken, and two, the disappearance of indigenous groups. And of course, as the second part of your question, Sam, acknowledges, is that there are indigenous groups there today, and they have a relationship to the remains. And so I think it's always, in my perspective, and in many of the archaeologists that I work with and whose work I value, having the consent of people and groups that are related to those histories are sort of at the utmost importance to interacting with the material remains of the past. And so I think that's really a question that's not for me to answer, really, but a question for indigenous groups in and around Heart Mountain to answer of how do they want things like projectile points to be treated? Do they want them returned? Are they things that they feel can be taken from the landscape? And so I think that's really the where the question should be, sort of how those questions should be redirected. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Koji. Anyone else want to jump in on Sam's question or sort of ethics more generally?
I guess to broaden the prompt a little to ethics more generally, I think about this a lot in the writing process, because, I am both writing a history of the Bureau of Reclamation, which is this humongous statist bureaucratic organization. And I'm also trying to center ethnic studies methods and center the voices of people of color. And both of those projects are sort of at odds with each other. And the reason why I think about ethics is there is a way of telling history where you remove individual actors. And to me, that has always felt a little bit uncomfortable. And I think that is why ethnic studies is trying to show that it's not just sort of the folks at the top of these bureaucratic ladders who are moving society in one way or another, that it's a much larger, messier narrative. And I'm going to pause there.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, Nicole. And I guess as someone who also does this work, but I'm pretending to just moderate this panel, I think a lot about silence. And as several of you brought up, like, how do you write about silence and leave space for gray areas? And I think that's part of what is the most creative and interesting part of the work that we do, but also challenging. And Koji, as you were talking about, sometimes a bowl is just a bowl, but sometimes it's a bowl that you brought from home or that held something in particular. And I think that's such a good example from archaeology that we encounter in all of our work of, like, how do you know when a bowl is just a bowl? And how do you know, and sometimes you know, but sometimes you don't. And so how do you write in a way that leaves space for that and that sort of invites people into that gray area? And I think that's where using art or literature or oral histories and being really explicit about the sort of moments where history and memory touch each other and are informing each other. And, sometimes I think that history and memory are kind of the same. And then there's moments where they need to be pulled apart. But I think for me, that becomes an ethical question too. Like, how do we leave that space so that we're not trying to paint actually a definite question, but our questions and the ways that we are answering them are actually just introducing more questions for folks. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that question of like silence or absence is, it's something Mika mentioned and Nicole mentioned, and it's like one of my favorite questions. I think it's like it's an impossible question. I think that there's no correct way, which means that there are maybe infinite possibilities or ways to try and then try again in the future. I think that one of the things I think about alongside that is what I'll call soft theory. And so rather than sort of like trying to impose like this very rigid theoretical interpretation, how can I use theory as one possible interpretation, but not the only possible interpretation? And I guess just like two things that are maybe kind of unrelated, but there's a group in Chicago called Nikkei Uprising who recently did a workshop on Japanese identity. And one of the things that came out of it is this idea that traditions hold ritual, but not purity. And so how do, like, as a cultural anthropologist, how can I make space for culture to change over time? Because of course, culture changes over time. And so what does it mean to be this very diasporic, maybe doubly diasporic, triply diasporic Japanese American community that has some relationship to Japan, but of course, that relationship has changed and things might look different. And so that's sort of something that I think is really useful. And then I guess just like, I'm seeing some of the audience questions, and I think there's this, like, to me and sort of what I study is Japanese American pilgrimages. And so I think there's this interest in like trying to figure out what happened to people's families or to people themselves who are trying to figure it out as adults or older adults looking back on their childhoods. And so I think that there's this interesting question about like, what is that need for meaning making mean? And sort of how, as a scholar, but also a community member, do I sort of reconcile like my own understanding of that from a personal space, but also being very curious about what is it that's motivating other people in this sort of desire to know, and what happens then when you can't know? Or what happens when what you have is your grandfather's FBI file, and what you want to know is, how did he feel the day he was arrested? And that question, you'll never get the answer to it. And so when you're left with the thing that you have, what are you supposed to do with it? How is it possible to close that gap?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what Lisa was talking about has given me another book recommendation for the audience. This one's a little bit outside of Japanese American incarceration, in that the author, Sadia Hartman, actually works on Black studies, but she has this kind of practice called critical fabulation, which is somewhere in between kind of working with the archive and developing history, and also thinking kind of about elements of creative fiction. and finding that really kind of slim line in between them in order to give life to potential possibilities, things that are about, like what Lisa mentioned, not just what happened, but also what these people having these lived experiences were feeling. We may never know for sure, but there can be a lot of worth in imagining potentials and thinking about the sheer number of threads that grew out of that, thinking about the number of different experiences that we have the capacity to kind of believe existed and kind of think through in the absence of kind of solid, kind of known fact.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I've heard Nicole and I work on many projects together, but one of them is also about going to sort of smaller sites of internment or incarceration, so DOJ sites, U.S. Army internment camps. And a lot of what we find at these places, none of them are places that we are finding, and they've all, been studied extensively before our presence there. But is this sort of like absence? And so I've heard Nicole narrate this, what do we do with sort of absence as its own form of evidence? And I think about that all the time, and I pose it all the time. Anyway, okay, we have more audience questions, and we're already approaching the end of our time here. Let's go to this question from Julie Abo, which I think is a good question and challenging one. Do you think we should have museums? What will museums look like, or how will they exist in your ideal future? And again, because I guess I always have to have the last word on these questions, I want to also invite you to expand this one out to think about your fields more generally. Like, what are your hopes for the fields in which you work? Or, the relationship between your field and Japanese American confinement sites, or Jack's sort of history in the future, whether that's related to museums or not. But maybe if someone has thoughts about museums, you could start. That's a great question, Julie. Thank you.
I mean, I can say, I think we should absolutely have museums. And I think I know where this question is coming from, in that the museum is often a site of colonial narrative making, right? If we take kind of the Indigenous example, oftentimes there were items that were stolen and housed in museums. They can also be perhaps harder to access than other forms, or are looking for a particular kind of story to be told. But I also think that they are kind of critical in terms of having public spaces with which to think through histories. And they can look really different depending on what that is. Like, we can have a giant museum that's dedicated to a single subject, like JANM, where many of our panelists kind of are staff members. And they can also be things that maybe exist in more unlikely locations, things that exist as multiple sites. Like, I'll use the example, because I was visiting over the weekend, of the Nikkei Museum and Cultural Center in Vancouver, British Columbia. And so the first floor is a cultural center where there's like badminton practice happening, kimono fitting, all of these things. And upstairs there's a used bookstore, but also has a long exhibit talking through the history of Japanese Canadians. And it's a really important way of doing that, I think, because it really speaks to these stories coming from a particular community that is not just what's on these walls, but is also all of these other things that are happening, and offering that space for community to exist, but also is able to tell a narrative that might not make it into kind of those community practices in as obvious a way. And so, like, one of the first panels at this cultural center exhibit in British Columbia is speaking specifically to the fact that Japanese Canadians have settled on Indigenous land. And it says that Japanese immigrants arrived soon after Britain colonized these lands, British Columbia, and that many of us, I'm quoting directly from the exhibit, have lived separate from Indigenous nations on their homelands. We have not always understood their history and ongoing relationship to land. We have lived and struggled for inclusion in a settler society. And so it's a process not only of naming Japanese Canadian history in this space and creating the kind of ongoing community as part of this community center, but also naming the fact that this history has taken place on Indigenous land and this community center also resides on those same lands. And so I think that's a really good way of thinking about the potentials of museums and the potentials of museums that might be a little bit different than the kind of pie in the sky version of museum that we all have in our heads.
Just going off of that, and I really love this question because I also think Erin and I have actually talked about this in a bar in Montana. And so you're queuing it up perfectly for us. I don't know if I have an answer, but I guess it's a question. Like, what would a museum look like if its central philosophies were that of accessibility and collaboration, right? Like, what would it look like if in the United States, anyone under the age of 18 had a free entry to any museum in the entire country? And so, I mean, I also think, as Mika said, like it is also about thinking of how power maps onto these institutions, and if these institutions can indeed be reformed or redress some of how they were made, etc. And so I love this question. I don't have the answers. I'd love to hear what folks say in the audience as well.
I think I've maybe also talked to Erin about this in a bar, not in Montana, but Erin and I are currently working as curatorial assistants at JANM on the core exhibit, which is currently Common Ground. So I think we're quite literally trying to think about like, not just hopefully this exhibit will open in 2025, but often in meetings we're like, in 2040, how will someone think about this text panel that we're writing in 2022? And what can we say that will seem relevant to somebody 20 years from now? And so in that way, I've sort of thought about it quite literally. I also have previously studied museums. And I think one of the things about museums is they're inherently object-based. So as we've been talking about archives, various archives, you know, you have these sort of document-based archives, but to what Koji was talking about, you sort of have this material culture archives, things. And frankly, like museums would be really boring if you didn't have things in them. If it was just presenting like papers for you to read, no one would go to museums. And so I think that it makes me think very deeply about like, what is the purpose of the objects that get displayed? But then I also, you know, like I think about like hyperrealism and sort of these like Borges short stories about like maps that are 1-to-1 scales. And so like, obviously you can't put all of the objects into a museum on display, at least, because museums both have like display spaces, but then most have repositories that are not publicly displayed. And so on the display side, you know, not only what do you include, but then also how do you interpret? Because a big piece of work that museums do is about interpreting for some kind of public audience. And so, you know, I think that to me raises this kind of question about like, well, what is the work of interpretation? Because you cannot just present all of the objects. There has to be a process of selection, which means there has to be a process of exclusion. And how can you make sure that the people who are making those decisions are more representative of the kinds of stories you want told and the kinds of perspectives you want to be brought forth? And then you get to like these very practical conversations that we're having, which is like, you know, the average visitor at JANM is a LA public school student in 9th grade, let's say. And so like, what does that student know? But then like, what does, you know, the audience member of this chat who goes to JANM, how are what they want out of the museum going to be different? And how do you make something that appeals to both groups? And then the final piece is like, you know, right now we're trying to put things in 80-word paragraphs. So how do you take something that's like a really interesting, we could talk about it for 3 hours and put it into 80 words? And so I think that there's all kinds of processes of sort of exclusion, and not just in a negative way, but like there has to be decision making. There has to be stuff that gets cut out. And how do you just sort of live with that?
I feel like we need a panel just on museums and should they exist. it's such a good question, and I think there's so many good points that everybody's been brought up and bringing up. And I've been thinking, I always think about museums a lot, and museums I hate, and sort of what I like to think of as glass box museums, where everything's in a glass box, versus the museums I find really, really inspiring. And I think that goes to really the question of, what do we want museums to do? Like, what work are they doing in the world and society? Are they preserving memory? Are they narrativizing history? Are they presenting objects to admire, to learn from, to gaze at? Are they interactive? And I think that's been a really interesting part of museums, not just ones that you can interact with, but ones in which memory is kept alive, or culture is kept alive through active participation. And so museums, not just as spaces to look at and read about history, but those museums and or sometimes heritage centers that both contain history, but also are vibrant parts of where people come to gather, to learn, to do at the same time. And so I think there are some really interesting examples around the world of museums where that happens, where people can participate in crafts, can participate in interacting with exhibits, and sort of co-creating a space of heritage and history making, and not just be presented history. And so those are the museums that I think are the most interesting, versus the, this is history, we're going to display it to you and tell you what it is.
Yeah, I thank you all so much for those answers. And I think these are, I mean, as we've all said, these are questions that don't have easy answers, but I think even just raising this idea of like, what is a museum? Much like when you approach a text, like, who is writing this text? What is the context out of which this text emerges? What is this museum? Like, where is its funding coming from? Who is it trying to serve? And sort of, as Nicole pointed out in the beginning, different reading practices of being in a museum and asking those same kinds of questions. Yeah, it's exciting. I think I love museums. I love reading all of the text, but I know like a lot of folks don't. There's many different ways to visit a museum, and that's one of the best parts about them. But I think, yeah, just sort of going in with a not critical in like, you know, things you don't like about it, but critical in terms of like, who is this serving and who is writing this? And, you know, how do we ask different and better questions of the stories that we tell about the past? We are at the end of our time, and Kimiko I was like, I think we'll be easy to keep it under an hour. And Kimiko was like, you guys could talk for forever. And I definitely could talk to all of you for a long time, but I know we all have things to do. I guess if folks have time for just sort of one last question/statement from the audience, what questions do you have about your study that still go unanswered? I'm going to add in there, or just sort of any final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with as we sort of wrap things up. And just thank you so much for being here and sharing your work and your time. That's a huge question to just drop, but go for it.
I'll maybe take an easy out. So I'm studying pilgrimages, and I think there's this whole anthropology of pilgrimages as sort of this practice. And so I used to tell you, like, why are they called pilgrimages?
Thanks, Lisa.
I think my question is not necessarily about the field, but field adjacent. So I think a lot about, how do we get high school students to love history? And how do we get some of the work we're doing at the university level around historical research? How do we get that to high school and middle school students and get them excited about the craft of research? That keeps me up at night. Okay.
I guess I'll go and enter in a sort of field wide question than a specific, in that thinking of archaeology that serves communities, and that's a really broad question, not just serves in the way of providing answers to questions, but an archaeology that the people who have relations to the landscape, to the history, to the wider place in which archaeologists do the work. How can there be an archaeology that's not extractive and just taking things, but also working to the interests, benefits, and powerful meaning making to all those involved? And so that's what I try to think through and wrestle with, and probably will not be able to answer, but will always ask.
So this is actually coming wonderfully full circle. I'm going to put her on the spot and say that the person who asked this final question is also the student I mentioned at the beginning of my spiel, who wanted the class to talk through history and memory. So hello, Ehi. Thank you so much for this question. But I think for literary scholarship, my real question is like, what's going to be written next, obviously, but really specifically thinking about kind of conversations that I feel like have become more and more central to thinking through Japanese American incarceration in its relationship to Indigenous lands, Indigenous sovereignty. And I think those conversations are happening kind of most interestingly right now at the level of archaeology, at the level of ethnography. And while there are literary texts that are thinking through those relations, I think there's a lot more to be explored there. And I'm excited to see sort of what new literature coming out from kind of authors writing now, writing in the future is going to do with some of these conversations.
Thank you all so much for those answers. Mika, thanks for inviting your students, and thanks for coming, students. I just want to thank each of you so much for this. This was really nourishing in so many ways for me. And audience members, thank you for your questions. Thank you for listening. We might have to do a part 2 at some point just to keep going with this. Maybe we'll be at a real bar. But just thank you so much. Thank you, Kimiko and Caroline behind the scenes, for running everything so smoothly. Tadaima is coming to an end actually tomorrow. So please join us for a few last panels, including one at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific time, with 2 fantastic artists in Providence, Rhode Island, where I live. So I'm selfishly plugging that. But otherwise, thank you all so much. This was really fantastic. I'm so grateful to each of you for being here and just for the work that you do and the people you are. And I will say good night to everyone and take care. Thank you.